Good morning, everybody. This is a special edition of WBRT Radio. The Pet Buzz will be back next week, maybe. And we have in studio with us, for those that are lucky to have Bardstown Cable Channel 19 on, you'll see we have with us was becoming a regular, and of course comes back from a long time ago in radio.
Way back when, Marconi, I think.
Way back. And our special guest today is his cousin, but also somebody that I'm so happy to be able to get finally on the radio. And that is, of course, Fenton Johnson, and who just not too many months ago was inducted in Kentucky Writers Hall of Fame. So congratulations on that. And you've had other accolades too. So
that's correct.
You left this community in about 17 years of age.
Well, I grew up in New Haven. Although actually I was born in Athertonville, just the other side. I was born in LaRue County. We had a rented house from the distillery in Athertonville, now long closed, but we rented a house from Seagram, which ran that distillery, and then we moved into town, quote unquote, when I was 6. But I'm the youngest of 9 kids, and the older kids all think that I was spoiled because I grew up with more or less with indoor plumbing, whereas they did not grow up with indoor plumbing. But I remember the outhouse very well, and I remember, the only way to take a bath was to go out in this kind of outbuilding, and my parents would heat water and pour it into a galvanized tub, and the dirtiest kids were saved for last.
That would be Barth, wouldn't it?
Would be Barth. I was always first, and Barth was last.
Barth was with the State Department of Fish and Wildlife for a long time.
So anyway, I left New Haven. I but Seagram's had a scholarship for a son or a daughter of a Seagram's employee that would pay everything, anywhere you got into school. So I got that scholarship, and as many of us did in those days, I took off for the romance of California. I went to college in California, and I was out there for many years. I worked for a couple of years for U.S. Representative Ron Mazzoli, those who are old enough to remember him, who has an interesting history that I always remark upon, and I know Ron was proud of this. He was hard to remember, but he was really the first, and I'm not even certain, maybe the last, person to be elected to the Kentucky congressional delegation. He was elected to the seat from Louisville, who was not out of the mainstream political establishment. He was a first-generation Catholic Italian, son of Italian immigrants, and he was very proud, and deservedly proud, of the fact that he was the first, and as I say, maybe the only person out of the Kentucky congressional delegation who was really an outsider to the political establishment. So I worked for him for a couple of years. Went to graduate school in Iowa, lived a long time in California, taught in New York City for a number of years, and then I took a job at the University of Arizona in Tucson, where I was for 20 years, and I've since retired and now live in the Hudson Valley, about 2 hours north of Manhattan.
Your writing began at what age and in what form?
Well, somebody asked my mother that question in an interview, and she said, he was always scribbling in the corner. And I guess that's true.
I can answer that better for you, Fenton. When Fenton, we had the privilege of bringing Fenton to St. Petersburg College, and the story goes, I was at a faculty mixer, and the husband of my dean, Dr. Martha Campbell, was a Methodist minister. And he came up to me and he says, I cannot believe I've just read the best book of spirituality I've ever read, and it was written by Johnson. And I went, Cousin Fenton? And it was. It's called Keeping Faith, A Skeptic's Journey. So the next thing I know, we're bringing Fenton for a speaking engagement at the college, and he came to my class. In addition to his other duties, he came to my class, and one of my students asked him how long he'd been a writer, and he said, ever since I picked up the first Crayola. And I loved that answer. You remember that answer, Fenton?
No, I don't. Gee. Well, I'm glad you remember that answer. I need you. I always need somebody to follow me around. It's an uneasy thing to. I've occasionally dated people who have really good memories, and I've learned to defer to them. We did this and that. No, it was the other way, and I am always.
You also had the great answer to another stupid question that my students, anyone who thinks there are no stupid questions has never taught. And I think Fenton would agree, would probably agree with that.
Although just I have to, you're correct. There are questions that make me wince,
yes,
and make me wonder whether I and the questioner read the same document. But I still try to bear in mind, and it took me a long time teaching to come to this realization that they're in the classroom to learn. Mm-hmm. And that it takes a certain amount of guts just to ask a question.
And it does.
And that has to be, one has to answer in a way that preserves the self-respect of the person who asked the really stupid question. And which is a challenge. It's a challenge. It's one of the challenges of teaching.
Yeah, well, the question was, at the end, I asked, what's the difference between you and our Mr. Johnson? Uh-huh. And Fenton thought for a moment, and he says, I'm a writer who teaches, and he's a teacher who writes. And I thought that probably paints the difference between the two of us more than anything.
It's true. I had many wonderful students over the years, but I still feel, and I feel like, and they've written me letters and. I think that I didn't wound them. I didn't damage them.
We didn't do any harm to them.
Right. Do no harm. Is the doctor's appropriate, first instruction, and as the teachers as well. But I was always teaching as a means to the end of keep making time for writing, and I understood that there were people who were really good teachers whose first priority was teaching, and and I had those priorities the other way around.
It was that was a very satisfactory answer to my students. So
I should have said a year and a half. That would have been actually, but anyway.
Yeah, that would have been the right answer.
You taught writing or what?
Yes, I taught in creative writing programs. You can, starting in the 1920s, someone had the idea that if you could get a degree in English, that you could actually teach students how to write, and the first creative writing program was famously, among literature world, founded at the University of Iowa, and it was the only one for something like 30 years, which is why the Iowa Writers Workshop is still, sort of famous simply because it got there first. But now there are, creative writing programs everywhere. The University of Kentucky has one. University of Louisville has one. You can enroll in creative writing classes, I'm sure, at Elizabethtown Community College. There are a lot of such courses around. But yes, I taught I got a master's in creative writing at the Iowa Writers Workshop. And then I taught at San Francisco State, and then I taught at Columbia and NYU, and then I went in New York, and then I went to the University of Arizona. Those were the principal jobs I've had, visiting gigs at St. Petersburg, Tarpon Springs campus. But those are the principal places I've taught.
What gives you inspiration for certain books or any of the books? Is it experiences you've had, or what you research, or the two?
Well, a combination of the two. More, I just visited Wendell Berry, who's an old friend who lives, off on the Kentucky River, about an hour north of Louisville, and he said, until you're 25, you can write on guts, but after that, you have to go to the library. And, a certain amount of, there's just the passion of telling a story. I grew up gay and ninth of 9 kids. My father was a distiller and from a family that had been involved in whiskey a long time. My mother grew up in LaRue County as Protestant, converted in order to marry my father. And as I've said, many people are aware, in what was at the time just a normal aspect of our lives, it was the 1960s. The gates, the enclosure at the Abbey of Gethsemane near New Haven were fairly open during that period, and the monks would often be coming and going. The monastery was involved in an experiment with capitalism, which didn't work out very well, but it was trying. Every monastery is always trying to figure out how to pay the rent, and it was involved in a lot of exterior projects. And so the monks were coming and going, and they would come to my parents' house to drink beer and smoke cigarettes and watch football on television, and the parties would last late into the night. And so that was a normal aspect of my childhood. We had Trappist monks at the dinner table. I don't know, 3 or 4 nights out of the week. And then I got out into the real world. This seemed like a normal way of being. And I would tell stories of my childhood and my fellow people who had gone to Tony prep schools in the Northeast or whatever, said I was making all this up. There was a famous incident where I said, well, of course my family was involved in moonshine. Everybody. And during Prohibition, if you want to call it moonshining, people were doing something legal, and then the government declared it illegal, and they continued making it. So yeah, it was moonshining. And they said, will you bring us a bottle of moonshine back from Kentucky, and we'll believe you. So I came back. It was Christmas my freshman year in college. And this was the sort of challenge my father loved, making fun of the Yankees. And so, but you couldn't take glass on the plane, and nobody was making moonshine anymore around here. You'd have to go up into Eastern Kentucky or whatever. But we had what we called white dog, which was, bourbon that's legally made, but then illegally tapped from the condenser when it's still clear, and it's about 125, 130 proof. And he put that in a Clorox bottle so that way I could carry it on the plane. And when I got it to California and opened it up, it smelled of Clorox and plastic because it had eaten away at the plastic. And I said, I'm not touching that stuff. But, the guys from the Tony Prep schools drank it all down, and at the time, and even now, I hope it gave them liver cancer. They made fun of me mercilessly. They made fun of my accent. They made fun of every aspect of my life. But it was an education,
Your experiences with monks at Gethsemane really did, I think, help the man who loved birds. The descriptions that you have of the areas of Nelson County.
Well, that you ask Roth where I get ideas. Here's a good example of those. Everybody thought that the character in that book was modeled after Johnny Boone, who just died. Mm-hmm. Not really. The person I didn't know Johnny Boone and knew little about him except by reputation, which everybody knew. But when I was 17 and very impressionable, I had gone off to California to the National Debate Tournament, and I came back for the summer and worked, and then I went back out to go to college in the fall. And just a couple of days before I left, this would have been September of '71, was when the state police took Charlie Stiles, who was part of that whole Raywick crowd of Stileses and people who lived still then very much on the edge of the law, if not entirely outside of it. They had a law, but it was their own law, and they would enforce it, and they were not interested in outsiders coming in. And the state police got tired of arresting him over and over and his getting off free, and they took him out in a cornfield and shot him, murdered him. There's no question about this. They took him to Spencer County to murder him, and I was really struck in my idealistic 17-year-old way that everybody knew that he had been murdered by the state police. Everybody knew that, and nobody said a word. It was just very quietly hushed up. And I thought, even then, someday I'm going to write a book about that. And so the main character, one of the two main characters in The Man Who Loved Birds, is a renegade marijuana grower who is really, in my imagination, Jesus in disguise. But he is severely dyslexic, so he can't read and write, as Jesus was probably so far as we know, was illiterate. And so that was kind of the murder of Charlie Stiles when I was 17 was planted a seed, and it took a very long time to grow. But that was the source of that book. And then, as Ned said, spending all that time with monks, and I was just interested in the process of how one grows into a kind of authentic spirituality, I guess, something that is deeper and richer and closer to the heart than just showing up at church on Sundays. And the book traces the journey of the monk sort of being taught how to love in every sense of that word. I think if I had to say there's a theme in my books, nonfiction and fiction, that there is often a journey of somebody in the book who is learning how to love.
Speaking of his nonfiction, of course, the major recognition, his first Lambda award was for geography of the heart. And it was on the reading list that my students could read. They had a choice of a bunch of different books. And I got this one wonderful review from a student named Hillary Michalski on geography of the heart. And in her review, she said, I started crying on page 27, and I didn't stop until I had put the book down. And I think that's a pretty good tribute to that book, Fenton.
Well, thank you. I have a dear friend who gave a blurb for the back, may she rest in peace, a wonderful Bengali American writer who was really the person who, now there are many famous Bengali or Bengali American writers. Arundhati Roy is probably the most famous among them. But Bharati Mukherjee was, she broke that particular barrier, and she had a blurb on the back she gave me a blurb in which she said, I wept without being depressed. What more can
that's a neat line, yeah.
I want to sort of open things up because, of course, we have two writers at the two teachers writers, and as we discussed, my writing is the first priority, and for Ned, I think it's his second priority, but nonetheless, I had a question in mind which I wanted to toss toward you, which is, I guess, you have a series of, I think of your principal work, Ned is writing collecting a series of anecdotes of his life, including anecdotes of events that happened at WBRT. Forewarned is forearmed. But I think of your long-term project being a series of thrillers or mysteries with a particular person at the heart of them. And I don't know how you got on that. Either that or your Mark Twain work. I think of those as being that's what I think of when I think of your writing, but I say that by way of offering you an opportunity to tell me, no, that's not right at all.
Well, see, my problem, I don't think there is any right or wrong when it comes to it. I write because I enjoy writing, and I know that but I don't. My Trespasser Killer series that is now expanded. I haven't published all 10 books of the
that's what I'm thinking of.
Series yet. I have the 8th book. No, I take that back. It'll be the 9th book. Will be from the Shameless Self-Promotion Department here, Roth. The 9th book will be part of the Author Spotlight that I'm a part of at the Nelson County Library next month, along with the nonfiction book, a sequel to From the Catbird Seat, Tales from the Diamond and the Hardwood. This is From the Catbird Seat 2, A Life in Sports, where I talk more. It's more, my editor, Mr. Tim Ballard, would tell you this book is more about me, as the first book was more about the coaching profession. So, but, my inspiration it really does come from things that have happened to me in my lifetime, and I've had a blast writing this vignettes series. I'm finishing up the 4th book now. It's called Fish Tales Unembellished. Now, Fenton has met my partner in fishing, Uncle Joe Ballard, and he knows that he's quite a character, but he doesn't have to make these stories up. So, Fenton, I guess you've read book 1 of that series. I sent you the first book of the vignettes series.
And did it make me want to rush down and volunteer to be on WBRT? I don't know. I think it struck terror in my heart more than.
Well, radio can be it's an interesting business for sure. Roth, as I said, Roth comes from, he's grown up from birth with local radio and has done such a tremendous job here. The station actually went corporate for a time being, and then Kenny Fogel came along and purchased it from Commonwealth, and then the Stratton family came along and purchased it from Kenny. And it's there's such a beauty in local radio. There's a horror. As Roth would tell you, there's a lot of scary days. Something's going to go wrong every day, but
on a lot of wood.
Oh my heavens! I still have that love for radio, and as to quote the great Jeff Van Oat, I have a face for radio.
Do you enjoy writing fiction or nonfiction more than, or is it the other way around?
Well, I was, speaking of Wendell Berry, whom we mentioned earlier, I was very pleased to read a poem that Wendell wrote that I read. I don't remember when he wrote it, but I read it in the last year or two. And it was a poem. I'm not going to be able to remember the details, but it was a poem in which he talked about how he dreaded going to work, to writing, and then once he was in writing, he immersed himself in it completely. And that's pretty much my experience of writing. I will do anything in the morning. I have a whole routine of procrastination that is, and I know that.
Did I mess it up?
Well, traveling messes it up.
No, you helped the procrastination is what you did.
But I know that if I just get down to it, then I get lost in it, and I tell myself that I must enjoy doing this because after I've been doing it for, it's safe to say at this point, a lifetime. Mm-hmm. But I'm not. I'm not by nature I'm not a sunny disposition person by nature. I'm sorry to say that. I have a kind of melancholic disposition by nature. I know people, Barbara Kingsolver comes immediately to mind, also a very close friend, who speaks with joy and enthusiasm about looks forward to going to the desk in the morning. I do not look forward to going to the desk in the morning. Couldn't I like go pull weeds or something, you know? Isn't there something out there that I have and the dishes aren't in the dishwasher or whatever? But once I get into it, I immerse myself in it, and certainly I have the experience of, I had that experience just last night well, first of all, writing something that I don't know where it came from. Who wrote that? I look back at my books and I say, who wrote that book? I don't know that person. For one thing, it's somebody who was much younger than I am now, of course. But you have a flyer for Scissors, Paper, Rock, the presentation that's coming up at the library later this week. Scissors was published in 1993, and I was living in San Francisco at the time. It was a terrible, terrible time. I realize now, looking back, most of virtually every gay man whom I knew in San Francisco died, and they often died in very, very brutal and terrible deaths. And this was also a time when, the religious figures telling gay people that they deserved to die, when in fact we now understand that that the activists did an enormous service, that HIV was present in frozen blood samples from as far back as the late 1950s in drawing attention to an epidemic that was going to happen one way or the other, and in bringing it to public attention so that there could be research done and a treatment evolved. Anyway, it was a dark time, and in dark times, I think certain kind of wisdom emerges, but there are sentences that I read in that book that I was not smart enough to write. They're good. I really admire them. But I think, who wrote that? Where did that come from? I don't know. Grief is like any wound. There is some terrible pleasure in it. Well, I guess that grew out of, watching all of my friends, helping all my friends die. So that is immensely rewarding. And Ned, I don't know if you have this experience, but I would say, like any discipline that you take on seriously, whether it is community service or cooking or gardening or whatever, one grows through the discipline. It teaches you. You have to, or sports. I mean, that's, I think, the reason. In striving to become better, you grow larger in some way or another than you thought yourself capable of being. It may not be the way that you set out for, but in some way you're going to become a larger person through the discipline of the work.
Practice, as we could break it down into that. I did want to also issue kind of a public thanks to Fenton, because you talked, Roth, you talked about motivation and inspiration earlier. The inspiration for my Trespasser Killer series came from an article that Fenton had as the cover of Harper's Magazine. I think it was called Going It Alone.
Oh yeah, that was their title, not mine.
That gave me the inspiration for my character of Conrad Nevitt, about being by himself. And you talked about the beauty of solitude, which is another book altogether. But that reading that article gave me the inspiration for the Trespasser Killer series. So thank you.
Well, I'm glad that it occasioned creativity.
So, did you mean with just a second ago when you were saying that when you look back today at this book you wrote, 93, that you wondered, how were you smart enough then to
Yeah, I don't. There is
smart enough is not the right term.
There is. Well, I would use the term wisdom. There is some wisdom in that book that is coming from someplace that I don't recognize, and yet it's my book. So, and I know where I was living at that time. I know the space that I was using as a writer space at that time, as my office at that time. But I think, so when did I write that, or where did I write that? And I don't know the answer to that question. The things that I like best in the book are, the things that are moving to me in the book are not things that at the time that I wrote them I thought, wow, that's really good, I have to keep that. They're usually written in a state of what I call transcendent boredom, which is where I've been, sitting at the desk for hours and nothing is working out, and I write something and then I just move on, and then eventually it's time to go do errands for the day or make supper or whatever. And then 3 months later, I'll look back and I'll see something and I'll say, wow, I'll keep that. That's pretty good. But there is a certain larger wisdom, kind of collective wisdom that the idea, I think, the hope is to tap into.
Well, why do you think the Kentucky Humanities Council, of all of your books, picked this one to talk about? Do you have a feeling for why?
Well, I can describe. Part of the reason was simply practical. They need a book that can be bought in large quantities, because what they do is, for this Kentucky Reads project, is they buy 600 copies of the book and they say to libraries, book clubs, any institution really in the state, we will, for a nominal fee, I think you have to pay $50, we will arrange for a scholar to come and visit your group, and we'll give you copies of the book. So all you have to do is pay $50 and you can get 5 copies, 6 copies, 10 copies. So they need to be able to buy a paperback edition of the book. And this book had been reissued by University Press of Kentucky, a chance to give them a plug and a blurb, because a recent administration in Frankfurt decided that the state with so many great writers from it and readers did not need a statewide press and wanted to eliminate it. Now, University Press of Kentucky does things like reissue books like Scissors, Paper, Rock that are set in Kentucky, but it also publishes books about everything from, wildflowers in Western Kentucky, history of Kentucky. Why wouldn't we want to have this institution? Right now, it seems on solid ground, and they do fantastic work. But they had brought this book out, and so it was available. That was simply the practical reason. But the other reason was, it tells the stories of a family that is making a transition that many Kentucky families are making, and are familiar with, which is the transition from an era in which, on one hand, family bonds were tighter and closer and more close-knit, simply because there were fewer transportation options, there was very little electronic media, People live many people live closer to the earth. I mean, all of that is something that might be viewed as a good thing. But at the same time, there was also tremendous pressure and restrictions on what you could do, what you couldn't do, what you could say, what you couldn't say. My oldest sister, for example, who wanted to be a doctor, was not allowed to take science classes because women were not allowed, and women weren't supposed to take science classes. Science was the province of men and men only. So, and then this close-knit family is making a transition where it is essentially being exploded into the modern world, and that happened in rural Kentucky in particular, because rural Kentucky was so insular and isolated, and then the 20th century seemed to arrive all at once. In the 1960s, a decade of great controversy and violence. And so I think the reason that Humanities Council chose it is that it portrays a rural Kentucky family in the course of that transition, which is an experience that many people in Kentucky are familiar with. Kids move to Louisville, the kids move to Cincinnati, the kids move to California, the parents are left at home, the kids come back from time to time and bring that far distant world back there, and there are conflicts that arise between the differing values and the old style values, and that's the subject of the book. And I think that they felt, and I felt, Bill Goodman, the director, and I had this discussion, that it was a very quintessentially Kentuckian book, I think I would say.
And again, Thursday night, 6:30, Nelson County Public Library. You're going to be there to discuss this book, and probably you'll get asked quite a few questions in the Q&A section that will occur.
Yeah.
And that's a free event, by the way, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, it's my price. I'm going to go because it's I don't have to worry about paying an entry fee. So.
You have a new book in the works, or maybe more.
Well, yes, I'm struggling with a book. I always choose the easy things to write about, like spirituality and sexual identity, and now race. Subjects that have no controversial value attached to them. I'm being ironic, of course. I discovered that there's a historical marker, a block from where we are sitting now. I discovered that my uncle, 4 generations removed, my mother grew up in Hodgenville in LaRue County, and I'd always assumed that her branch of the family had settled originally in LaRue County long, long, long ago. In fact, they settled in Bardstown, and both sides of the family were from Nelson County. The Johnsons around New Haven and the Hubbards in Bardstown. And only when my grandfather, 4 generations removed, went bankrupt did his sons move to Hodgenville in the 1840s, late by local standards. So my uncle, Austin Hubbard, was a prominent early Bardstown citizen. The earliest record I've found of him is around 1790. Still the second wave of Anglos to come to this part of the world. But he, in a drunken moment on his deathbed, wrote a 1-paragraph will in which he left all of his, by the standards of the time, fairly large estate to an enslaved young woman named, 16 years old, named Narcissa. And that led to 20 years of lawsuits in which she first tried to buy her freedom because as a slave she could not inherit property, and then sued the men who had been defrauding her of that, who had been deliberately keeping her enslaved because in the meantime they were raiding the estate. And as my sister Suzanne Livonian, who lives in Bardstown and is now overseeing the records at the courthouse, says, if you want to be remembered, don't publish a best-selling book or any book. Go to court. Because, those court records are kept, and I've been done a great service by many people across history in Nelson County, because I can tell you that the records in this courthouse are both better preserved and better organized than probably any records in any courthouse in Kentucky, if not anywhere. It is relatively easy to find, it's not easy, but it is relatively easy to find documents from the past, even deep in the past, such as those that still exist in the Nelson County records. So I've been investigating that and trying to reconstruct the history of her lawsuit against the men who were defrauding her, and its how that all eventually turned out. And in the course of that, looking at the evolution of the African American population and the white population in Nelson County from the earliest days through the Civil War, which I now call the War of Emancipation, to the present.
I'm glad you always take the easy path to these books.
Yes, well, I mean, this story, she's a relative of mine. She's my, first cousin, 4 generations removed. She had 2 sons, one of whom I have traced his paper trail is quite clear. I know exactly what happened to him. He was emancipated, manumitted, as we would say, as I said at the time, with what money was left of the estate after finally, eventually, a little bit of it got into her estate. She was mysteriously died at 30 years old. He was manumitted. He moved to Louisville and became a prominent citizen in the Louisville African American community. Married, had a daughter who died young, and therefore he has no descendants. The other son is a much foggier trail, and I believe he ran away across he's self-liberated, as we say, to Indiana, and eventually joined the U.S. Colored Troops. And after the War of Emancipation, moved to Ohio, married, and had a daughter whom he named Fenton, which is right there on the 1870 and 1880 federal censuses. And so this has, of course, caused me to wonder whether my name, which I had been told, my somewhat unusual name, I had been told originated with the Trappist monks at Gethsemane, told me, maybe in fact, there was some other origin for that name that was never revealed to me, or maybe not even known. I do know, based on this, a scrap of one letter that I found, that my parents' generation did know about Narcissa. They knew about this cousin, this mixed race cousin. They knew about this story. It was never passed on for reasons that I'll explore in the putative, the Ohala from My Lips to God's Ears book that I'm working on now.
Do you have a timetable for getting this book done?
One thing that writing is, I'm not a patient person, and one thing that writing has taught me is patience. It's a very challenging subject to write about because white people have been telling black people stories for far too long, and here I am, a white person, telling a black person's story. On the other hand, she's my relative. These are my relatives, and I'm sensitive to that. I'm not, and working out that conundrum needs to take as much time as it needs to take. I'd love to think that I would have a final draft done in another year. I've been working on it 2 years. The Faith book took from really its inception in '96. It was published in 2003, and in mainstream publishing, it typically takes a year from the time the manuscript is submitted to when it appears. So the Faith book, Keeping Faith, took about 6 years. Most of my books have taken, if all scissors, paper, rock, really from beginning to end, took about 6 years. If that is the case here, I'm only a third of the way into the process. Oh my God.
So morning procrastination, and afternoon you become a patient person.
No, I the best time is like between 10 and 12 o'clock in the morning. You know, I usually am. I make myself, and I try not to. I try not to do it. I don't make appointments. I don't take phone calls. I don't do anything in between the roughly 8 a.m. to noon. But the first hour of that is.
Well, you know, that's the Hemingway method.
Yeah.
That's the way Ernest Hemingway did his situation. He blocked off the morning.
Fenton, this book, is it one that's closest to you that you're writing because of the family? And does that make it tougher, or?
Yeah, it definitely makes it harder. Anytime, Barbara Kingsolver says, I don't write about friends and relatives because I want them to remain friends and relatives. It's tough to write about people because I don't have I'm acutely sensitive to the power of the word in print. And I was reminded of that, in fact, by a genealogical relation that I should be able to describe but can't. It wasn't Jane, it wasn't your sister, but it was someone I had very early on. I published a piece in the New York Times Magazine, in which was about New Haven and growing up there, and I said something like, finally the town got its first policeman. Collectively we bought off the policeman, but we couldn't, but television proved less tractable. And it was about, and really the point of what I was writing about was the change that happened when television arrived, and how radically different that bringing the outside world into the unfiltered outside world into these communities, because in those early days of television, they didn't censor anything. They didn't filter it. You just saw what was going on. It
was my mother that was mad at you over that.
And at any rate, so someone at a family reunion, your mother came
it was one of the first stories you told me.
And said, it wasn't the first policeman I was talking about. It was the second policeman. And I had not, and she was appropriately angry at me for having effectively accused her husband of corruption. In fact, there was a corrupt policeman, but it wasn't the one that
It wasn't Ned Johnson Sr., let's put it that way.
Yeah, and that was a very valuable lesson, because you got to get it right, and if you don't have it right, then you need to either fudge or give up the project.
Hell hath no fury like a half-ballard scorned. And she felt scorned.
Well, she was correct, and it was to write about responsibly, to use that power of the word in print responsibly is real challenge. Some would argue. One of the reasons that the character in The Man Who Loved Birds, that I made him illiterate. He's illiterate because he's severely dyslexic. He's not at all dumb. One of the mistakes that we make in this society over and over again is to equate literacy with intelligence. There are people who are illiterate who are extremely intelligent, and unfortunately people who are very literate who are really dumb. But I wanted to investigate the relationship between this thing that I do most days of my life, which is writing, scribbling on the page, the relationship between that and what I would call some kind of authentic spirituality or whatever. And in that book, it's a good example of how at least for me, the fiction writing process works. I was way into the book, 2 years into the book. And that character, his name is Johnny Fay, he wouldn't, every time anybody would give him anything to read, he would refuse it, or somebody would ask him to write something and he would decline. And I didn't know what that was about. And then finally, like a year and a half into writing the book, or maybe longer, one day I thought, oh, he doesn't know how to write. That's why he's saying no, which is why people who are severely dyslexic, or I went, in fact, the research part, I went to the Tucson Reading Center and talked to some people, and I said, talk to me about, how people who are not able to read function in the world. And they operate by, they have much better memories. They operate by vision. They can recognize the words on a sign without necessarily being able to read them. So they have better memories than people who can actually write things down, I'm going to remember what to buy at the grocery store and make a list. Well, someone who is non-literate doesn't have to do that because they have a better they remember things. So it was and that was really, in retrospect, enjoyable, that exploration between what writing means, this thing that I do every day, and having a character who can't do it, who's a very smart character but who can't do it.
I know a few people that are in the writing world are in songs, and they go in and sit down and knock out songs every day. And I meet you and you talk about books that take years of research, and whether it's fiction or nonfiction research to learn, and it just amazes me. Kentucky you're one of the newest members group of the Writers Hall of Fame in Kentucky. We have some magnificent writers in Kentucky. You mentioned Wendell Berry. We talked, is there a reason that you see for that? And maybe I'm just not familiar with writers in other states, but to me, I guess maybe I'm also very proud of Kentucky, but it seems like we have some magnificent people that have written contemporary now and even back.
I agree, and in fact, I've had this. We talk about writers, talk about librarians, booksellers in Kentucky. This subject comes up from time to time, and we all feel, while offering the appropriate observation, that maybe it's just because we're not in Tennessee that we don't understand that they have as many great writers as we do. We just don't know.
Yeah, Mississippi would probably the Mississippi writers probably would take exception.
I would say Mississippi and Kentucky are, in this particular way, are a pretty good analogy because they were isolated from technology and electronic media, especially television, for a long time. Just the geography of Kentucky is such that until really it was technology developed a strip mine, but the technology for blasting roads through the mountains came along. The first time I worked with Appalshop, the Southeastern Appalachian Cultural Center in Whitesburg, a lot, and the first time I drove down there, it took like 8 hours to get there from here, and now you can get there in 3 hours. That isolation, a sense of storytelling that grows in a culture where people's primary means of communicating information, including emotional information, is through storytelling. That is all part of the culture here. It does give me an opportunity to say something I read by the great black prophet James Baldwin the other day, which is that he loved the United States, he loved America enough to criticize it. And we have to be, I would say, if I can call myself a Kentuckian, I spend more time here, certainly, than many people who call themselves Kentuckians. we have to be careful that our pride in the place does not blind us from seeing the flaws that we have and the blind spots that we have. And one thing that is central to what I'm writing about now that is never talked about and most people are unaware of, Nelson County in 1860 was almost 40% black. It was 39.7% black. And you have to imagine that, walking down the street in Bardstown today, what happened to all those people? And those people went away because the world for them was made so unpleasant that they didn't, the myth is, and there was some truth in it, they moved away for economic opportunity. Well, of course that's true, and that was true of a lot of the white people from the country. But Jim Crow laws, violence, that's all very much back. That you go into the courthouse records and you have no trouble finding lots of evidence of that. And that is not part of the story that we're telling ourselves. And we need to think about who gets left out of that story and why they're left out of that story. And I fear with these Don't Say Gay laws that are passing now, that because what happened, it's very clear, the legislature from 1840 to 1880 passed a series of increasingly draconian laws that were essentially designed to make life so unpleasant for African American people that they would leave. And I fear that we see the same thing happening now with LGBT people. We can't, kill you off, especially since we don't really know who you are. But we can make life so unpleasant for you that you'll leave. And I know of, it's an issue I wrestle with a lot. And it's an issue that, some of the, I won't name names, but some of the most prominent LGBT people in the state that I know are grappling with right now.
I'm afraid that's true, and you can pick up the newspaper and still read it.
Yeah.
If you read it from the right perspective.
Yeah.
Well, Fenton, I have just enjoyed this hour, and for those that are listening and watching, you can enjoy more on Thursday night at 6:30 at the Public Library here. And then graciously, you and Mr. Ned are going to be guests of our Kiwanis Club today, and I hope that they're over there waiting for us.
Okay.
So we certainly appreciate it very much. Ned,
thanks for letting me sit in. I appreciate it. I got to thank Fenton for something I wanted to thank him publicly for a long time. So
thank you. I appreciate that.
That is our show today. The news is coming up at some point here on WBRT Radio.